The morning sun rolled gently over the Thompson vineyard, casting a golden haze on the vines that stretched endlessly across the Texas hills. Autumn had painted the leaves in shades of rust and amber, and the air carried that faint scent of soil and oak barrels, the smell of a life Rebecca Thompson had known for over 40 years. She stood by the kitchen window, her hand steady as she sliced apples for the pie she made every Tuesday. Tuesdays were for visits. Every week since Robert's passing, Isabel came by for breakfast, the perfect daughter-in-law in every imaginable way. Impeccable hair, subtle perfume, makeup that never seemed to smudge even in the Texas heat. Rebecca had always admired her poise, the way she seemed to hold everything together after losing her father-in-law. She must have loved Robert deeply, Rebecca used to think. It was comforting to believe that. That morning, Isabel was her usual self, polite, sweet, but distant. She complimented the house, the pie, the vineyard view, as if rehearsing lines from a script. "I'll stop by the market on my way back," she said cheerfully, slipping on her beige cardigan. "Thomas mentioned we're having guests for dinner tonight. Do you need anything?" Rebecca smiled softly and shook her head. "No, dear. I've got everything I need." She watched Isabel leave, her heels clicking on the porch. The sound faded into the distance. The kitchen felt too quiet, the air too still. Rebecca poured herself another cup of coffee, savoring the silence. It was the kind of quiet she had learned to live with since Robert's death, a quiet filled with memories that refused to rest. Then a sound broke through, faint, metallic, insistent. A vibration on the wooden console near the front door. Rebecca turned. It was Isabel's phone. She must have left it behind. Rebecca hesitated. She wasn't the type to pry. She had been raised on manners and boundaries, on the belief that privacy was sacred. Yet the phone kept buzzing, a small blue light blinking with each call. She walked closer, meaning only to see who was calling. Maybe Thomas, maybe the dinner guests. But when she looked down, the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The name on the screen froze her blood. Robert Thompson. For a moment, her mind refused to connect the dots. Robert, her husband, dead for 5 years, smiling in the contact photo wearing a shirt she didn't recognize, standing in front of a cabin she had never seen. The phone vibrated again. A text message appeared. "Thursday, same time. I can't wait to see you again." Her breath caught in her throat. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the tile floor, scattering pieces like fragments of her sanity. Rebecca stared at the glowing screen, unable to move. The logical part of her mind screamed that there had to be an explanation, a prank, a wrong number, a coincidence. But the photo, the shirt, the message, it was too specific, too intimate. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She remembered the funeral, the closed casket, the way Thomas had cried at her shoulder. The coroner had said the body was badly damaged from the heart attack and the crash. She had never looked inside. She had trusted them. Rebecca's fingers trembled as she set the phone back exactly where she'd found it. She needed to think, to breathe, to not lose control. The rational side of her, the teacher, the wife, the woman who had survived loss, told her to stay calm. But another voice, darker and sharper, whispered that something was very, very wrong. When Isabel returned a few minutes later, out of breath and smiling, Rebecca was sitting quietly at the kitchen table, hands folded over the newspaper. "Oh, I must have left my phone," Isabel said lightly, spotting it on the console. "Good thing I didn't get far." Rebecca managed to smile. "Yes," she murmured. "Good thing." As Isabel tucked the phone into her bag and left again, Rebecca watched her drive down the dirt road until the car disappeared behind the hills. The morning sun had lost its warmth. She didn't know what the message meant. Not yet. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. From this day forward, she would watch Isabel Hartman very carefully. The afternoon sun slid behind the hills, spilling long shadows across the vineyard outside. The house had gone still again, too still, the kind of silence that pressed against Rebecca's ears and demanded to be filled. She had tried to distract herself with chores, folding linens, polishing the silver, sweeping the kitchen floor, but her hands moved without purpose. Her mind was trapped on that name glowing on Isabel's phone. Robert. It wasn't just the name that haunted her. It was the certainty of it. The photo. The new shirt, the message. Thursday, same time. Those words kept echoing in her head, taunting her with possibilities she couldn't yet face. Finally, she decided she needed proof. Something tangible. Something that would tell her this was just a misunderstanding, or that she wasn't losing her mind. Rebecca took the narrow wooden staircase down to the basement, her hand grazing the railing Robert had built himself decades ago. The air smelled faintly of old paper and oak varnish. The basement office hadn't changed since the day he died. His chair still sat behind the desk, his ledgers lined neatly on the shelves, the faint scent of cigar smoke clinging to the walls like a ghost that refused to leave. Thomas never touched the room. He said it felt wrong. Rebecca had agreed until now. She flicked on the old lamp, its warm light cutting through the dust. The desk was exactly as Robert had left it. Bills, vineyard records, a leather-bound planner from years ago. Nothing unusual at first glance. But Robert had always been meticulous, and meticulous men always had secrets. She ran her fingers along the drawers, one by one. Receipts, insurance forms, photos from wine festivals. Then, as she tugged on the bottom drawer, it stopped halfway. Stuck. Rebecca frowned and pulled harder. Something was wedged behind it. Her pulse quickened. She reached behind the drawer, fingertips brushing against the edge of something smooth, a box. She eased it out, heart hammering. It was small, carved from dark cedar wood, with a brass clasp dulled by time. She didn't remember ever seeing it before. For a moment, she hesitated. Opening it felt like crossing a line, one that would separate the life she knew from whatever waited on the other side. Then she unlatched the clasp. Inside lay a stack of photographs, wrapped in tissue paper. She unfolded them slowly, her breath catching as the first image came into view. Robert, smiling, healthy. Standing by a lake Rebecca didn't recognize, his arm around Isabel. The photo was sharp, recent. Too recent. Rebecca flipped it over. The date printed on the back was less than a month ago. She stared at it, her fingers trembling. Another photo. Isabel laughing, her hand resting on Robert's chest. Another, the two of them at a wooden cabin porch. Glasses of wine raised to the camera. Rebecca's throat tightened as she realized the bottle label was from their vineyard. A rush of heat surged through her chest. It was as if every cell in her body rebelled at once, disbelief colliding with betrayal. For 5 years, she had mourned this man, prayed for his peace, tended his grave. For 5 years, she had believed she was the widow of a good man. Now, staring at those smiling faces, Rebecca felt something inside her fracture. The grief she had carried for years curdled into something colder, heavier, anger. She set the photos down carefully, like evidence at a crime scene. Her mind was already turning, sharp and deliberate. She remembered the lake behind the old property Robert claimed he had sold. He hadn't, and if the cabin still stood, it might hold the truth of who her husband really was. Rebecca rose, locking the box in her arms. Tomorrow, she decided she would go there herself. The next evening. The sun hung low over the Texas hills, sinking in a wash of copper and violet. The road that led to the old lake property wound through narrow trails lined with mesquite and oak. Rebecca gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale in the fading light. She hadn't been down this road in more than a decade, not since Robert had told her he'd sold the land after the wildfire scare. But the coordinates she'd found scribbled on the back of one of the photographs led her here. to the edge of a quiet lake surrounded by willows and reeds. The air was cooler, the world hushed except for the soft whine of crickets and the ripple of water against the shore. When she saw the cabin, her heart stuttered. It was supposed to be gone, sold, demolished, forgotten. Yet there it stood, solid and alive, the cedar siding freshly oiled, a porch light glowing faintly under the eaves. Flower pots lined the steps, still damp from watering. Someone had been here not long ago. Rebecca parked her car beneath a tree, her headlights off. For a moment she sat motionless, staring at the small wooden house that had no right to exist. Then she stepped out, the gravel crunching softly under her boots. Her breath clouded in the chill as she approached the door. She turned the handle. It was unlocked. The hinges groaned as she slipped inside. The faint scent of perfume mixed with something familiar, the woody aroma of Robert's favorite wine, Merlot from their 2014 harvest. On the counter sat an open bottle and 2 half-filled glasses, condensation still clinging to the stems. Her pulse quickened. Whoever had been here had left recently. The cabin was neat but lived in. A folded sweater draped across the couch. A scarf on the chair, silk, crimson, unmistakably feminine. Rebecca picked it up, her stomach twisting. Isabel's perfume lingered on the fabric. She moved deeper inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the curtains. The living room walls were decorated with framed photographs, not of landscapes or art, but of people. Some were of Robert from years ago, smiling, vibrant, alive. Others showed a man who looked exactly like him. The same jawline, the same eyes, only younger, broader in the shoulders, his skin untouched by illness. On the mantel sat one photo that made Rebecca's hands go cold. It was a picture of Isabel and the man. Isabel in a sundress, laughing with her head tilted toward him, his arm wrapped around her waist, his face pressed close to her hair. It was intimate, tender, and utterly wrong. Rebecca stepped back, her breath sharp and shallow. The room spun around her, the wine, the photos, the scarf, the laughter frozen in the frame. Every detail screamed that Robert's death had not ended anything. It had only buried the truth deeper. A noise outside shattered her trance, the low rumble of an engine approaching, headlights sweeping across the window. Rebecca froze. Panic surged through her chest. Through the thin curtain, she saw a pickup truck rolling to a stop near the porch. A door opened. Footsteps crunched on gravel. She had seconds. Rebecca darted toward the back, slipping out through the kitchen door. Her shoes sank into the damp earth as she ran along the edge of the trees. Behind her, she heard the cabin door creak open, then close again. A man's voice, deep, faintly familiar, called out something she couldn't make out. She didn't stop until she reached her car. Her breath came ragged, her heart slamming against her ribs. As she started the engine and drove away, the reflection of the cabin lights danced in the lake's surface like ghosts waving her off. Only when she was miles down the road did she allow herself to breathe. Her hands were still shaking, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. Whatever she had seen tonight, the photos, the man, the voice, it wasn't imagination. Rebecca Thompson knew one thing now with absolute certainty. She had buried a body, yes, but whether it had truly been her husband's, she could no longer be sure. The morning broke gray and cold, the kind of Texas morning when the mist clings low over the hills, turning every sound into a whisper. Rebecca drove slowly along the narrow county road that led to St. Mary's Cemetery, her old Buick rumbling against the gravel. The radio was off. Even the birds seemed quiet. When she arrived, she parked beneath an oak that had shed most of its leaves. The cemetery was nearly empty, save for a caretaker raking fallen branches near the gate. Rebecca wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck and made her way up the hill, past rows of weathered stones, until she reached the grave she knew by heart. Robert James Thompson, 1952 to 2018. Beloved husband and father. The words were carved deep into granite, smooth from years of wind and rain. She stared at them for a long time, her breath shallow, her fingers tracing the cold edge of his name. She remembered the funeral, the closed casket, the smell of lilies, the church bells tolling softly in the afternoon sun. People she barely knew had come to offer condolences, telling her Robert had been a good man, that he'd left behind a legacy of kindness and hard work. Rebecca had stood beside that casket in numb disbelief, clutching Thomas's arm, never daring to look inside. The coroner had said it wasn't necessary. The heart attack and the crash left him unrecognizable, he'd explained. But now, standing here 5 years later, Rebecca couldn't ignore the questions clawing at her chest. What if the man in that coffin hadn't been Robert? What if she had mourned a stranger? A gust of wind swept through the graveyard, scattering leaves across the marble. She took it as her cue to leave. On her way back to town, she stopped at the sheriff's office, a small brick building that looked more like a feed store than a law enforcement hub. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson," said Sheriff Dean Rucker, a man in his late 50s with a kind face weathered by years of Texas sun. "Haven't seen you in a while. Everything all right out at the vineyard?" Rebecca forced a polite smile. "It's fine, Sheriff. I had a strange question." He gestured for her to sit. "Go on." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Is it possible, legally, medically, for someone to fake their own death? With a heart attack and a car crash, I mean." The sheriff raised his eyebrows. "That's a hell of a question for a Tuesday morning." "I know," she murmured, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's hypothetical." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "Technically possible, sure. Rare, though. Takes planning, money, access to the right people. Why do you ask?" Rebecca gave a small shrug. "Old habits. Robert used to say life insurance is the only thing that proves a man's really gone." The sheriff chuckled, but his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, as if trying to read what she wasn't saying. "Well, Mrs. Thompson, unless you've got reason to think otherwise, I wouldn't lose sleep over ghosts." She smiled faintly. "Of course, just curiosity." When she left the station, her pulse was still racing. Technically possible, but rare. The words looped through her head like a whisper from someone standing just behind her. That night, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table with a pen and notepad, sketching out a plan. She had questions no lawman could answer, questions only the cabin by the lake could resolve. By morning, she had ordered 2 small motion-activated cameras online. If the dead were walking in Texas, she intended to catch them in the act. A week passed like a fog that refused to lift. Rebecca barely ate, barely slept. Every sound in the house felt magnified, the tick of the clock, the groan of the old floorboards, even the wind brushing against the shutters. She moved through each day, mechanically, tending to the vines, answering Thomas's calls with practiced calm. But her thoughts were consumed by the cameras she had placed at the cabin. 2 tiny motion sensors, one hidden in the eaves above the porch, another tucked behind a flower pot near the window. She had driven out early in the morning, her hands trembling on the steering wheel as she installed them. Each time she glanced over her shoulder, she imagined headlights emerging from the mist. But no one came. When the cameras blinked to life, she felt both relief and dread. Now, a full week later, it was Thursday, the day in the message, the day Robert, or whoever he was supposed to meet Isabel. Rebecca sat at her kitchen table that night, the laptop open before her, its blue light flickering across her lined face. Outside, the sky was dark, the vineyard silent. She clicked the first file. The timestamp read Thursday, 5:47 p.m. At first, there was nothing but stillness. The cabin porch, the lake shimmering faintly in the distance, wind stirring the grass. Then, at 5:58, a car appeared on the dirt road, Isabel's silver sedan. Rebecca's breath hitched. She watched as Isabel stepped out, her hair loose, wearing jeans and a white blouse. She carried a grocery bag and moved with easy familiarity, unlocking the cabin door like she had done it 100 times. Minutes later, the footage inside the cabin came alive. Isabel lit candles on the table, humming softly to herself. She wiped the counter, straightened the cushions, opened a bottle of red wine, their wine. Rebecca recognized the label instantly. Thompson Vineyard Reserve 2014. Her heart clenched. Then headlights swept across the window. Isabel turned toward the sound. A black pickup truck rolled to a stop outside. Rebecca leaned forward, her breath shallow. The door opened. A man stepped out. For a heartbeat, she thought the feed had glitched, that the screen had frozen on an image from years ago. The man moved into the light, tall, broad-shouldered. His hair touched with gray, the same easy gait she had watched for decades. Robert, or someone who looked impossibly like him. He climbed the porch steps, and Isabel met him halfway. She touched his face like she'd done it countless times before. Then she kissed him. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. The room spun. Her pulse roared in her ears. She rewound the video, convinced she'd imagined it. But there it was again, the embrace, the laugh, the kiss that erased 5 years of grief with one frame. Her husband, dead and buried, was standing on that porch. Or his ghost was. Rebecca forced herself to keep watching. They sat together on the couch, glasses in hand, talking, laughing. The man brushed Isabel's hair from her face, leaned close, whispered something that made her smile. There was no hesitation, no disguise, no fear of being seen. The footage ran for nearly 2 hours before the cabin went dark. Rebecca sat frozen long after the screen turned black. Her chest felt hollow, her skin cold. She wanted to scream, to throw the laptop against the wall, to demand the world make sense again. But she didn't. Instead, she closed the computer and stared out the kitchen window into the night. Somewhere out there, a man with her husband's face was living a life she was never meant to see. For the first time in years, Rebecca didn't feel like a grieving widow. She felt like a hunter. She knew what she had to do next. She wouldn't call the police. She wouldn't tell Thomas. This wasn't for the law to solve. It was for her. The next day, the wind carried the scent of rain across the hills as Rebecca drove toward the lake once more. The sky was heavy with clouds, pressing low over the water, the color of tarnished silver. Every mile closer, her heartbeat grew slower, steadier. Fear had turned to resolve. Whatever waited for her in that cabin, she needed to see it, to look it in the eyes. When she arrived, Isabel's car was already parked out front. Rebecca didn't bother hiding her own. She stepped out, shutting the door with a deliberate thud that echoed through the still air. A light flickered in the window, followed by the faint sound of voices inside. She walked straight to the door and pushed it open. The reaction was instant. Isabel dropped the glass she was holding, the wine spilling across the rug like blood. "Rebecca!" she stammered, her face draining of color. What are you doing here?" Rebecca didn't answer. Her gaze moved past Isabel to the man standing by the fireplace. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. He looked exactly like Robert. The same eyes, the same hands, the same faint scar on his chin from that vineyard ladder fall 20 years ago. He froze too, as if staring at his own ghost. Then, in a calm, practiced voice, he said, "You must be Rebecca. I've wanted to meet you." She stared at him, every muscle rigid. "You look like my husband." "I'm not," he said quietly. "My name is Ricardo Hale, Robert's twin brother." Rebecca blinked, uncomprehending. "Twin brother?" "Yes." We were separated as children, adopted by different families after our parents died. I grew up in New Mexico. Robert tracked me down about 6 years ago, right before his heart problems started. We met a few times. He took a slow step forward, his voice smooth, rehearsed. When he needed a bone marrow donor, I was the only match. I came to Texas to help him. We stayed in touch until he passed. I'm sorry for your loss. The words sounded sincere, but something in his eyes wasn't. Rebecca felt a chill crawl up her spine. If that's true, she said slowly, why didn't he ever tell me? Ricardo hesitated, his jaw tightening. He said he didn't want to burden you, that you'd been through enough with his illness. The lie was almost elegant in its simplicity. Too neat, too ready. Rebecca's gaze flicked to Isabel, who stood trembling near the table, her hand clutching the back of a chair. And you? Rebecca asked softly, how long have you known about this? Isabel's lip quivered. Not long, she whispered. I met Ricardo a few months after Robert died. I didn't know at first. I thought I was losing my mind, seeing his face again. But he explained, and we became close. Close, Rebecca repeated, her tone flat. Isabel's eyes filled with tears. Please, you don't understand. Before Robert died, She stopped herself, covering her mouth. Rebecca's voice was like ice. Say it. We were together, Isabel choked out. For a few months. Before his heart attack. It wasn't supposed to happen. He said he loved me, that he'd leave you after he recovered. And then he died. And Ricardo stepped in to comfort you, Rebecca finished for her, her voice steady but hollow. Ricardo tried to speak, but Rebecca raised her hand. Don't. Not one word more. The silence that followed was unbearable. The sound of rain began tapping against the windows, slow and rhythmic, like a metronome to her unraveling thoughts. Rebecca looked at the two of them, the woman she had welcomed into her home, and the man wearing her husband's face, and something inside her went still. Not broken, not bleeding, just cold. She turned toward the door. You've both said enough. Rebecca, please, Isabel cried, reaching for her. Rebecca stopped in the doorway and looked back, her voice quiet but cutting through the room like glass. You don't know what you've done. Then she stepped out into the rain, her silhouette swallowed by the gray mist. She didn't drive home right away. She stood by the lake for a long time, staring at the rippling water until her reflection blurred and disappeared. The woman who had walked into that cabin had been grieving, confused, afraid. The one who walked away was something else entirely, steady, silent, and watching. Rebecca Thompson no longer needed answers. She needed justice. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the desk lamp that bathed Rebecca's living room in amber light. Outside, the wind swept through the vines, their skeletal branches tapping lightly against the windows. Midnight had long passed, but Rebecca hadn't moved for hours. She sat perfectly still in her armchair, the laptop open before her, the sound of Isabel's voice echoing softly from the recording. She pressed rewind once more, just to make sure she had heard correctly. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Isabel's voice trembled on the recording. Robert said everything was ready, the insurance papers, the crash, the fire. He said he'd come back once things settled. But when the time came, a pause. Then the faint sound of glass clinking. Ricardo's voice, calm, steady. He had the heart attack for real, didn't he? Yes, Isabel whispered. We thought he was pretending at first. But then he collapsed, and he didn't get back up. Rebecca froze, her stomach twisted. So what did you do? Ricardo asked. We panicked. The plan was already in motion. The car, the documents, the cremation order. If we told the truth, everything would fall apart. You know how the town talks. I would have been ruined. Rebecca leaned closer to the laptop. Isabel's breathing quickened on the recording. You helped me bury him, Isabel continued. You said no one would question it if the body was too damaged. We made it look like the crash was worse than it was. There was a beat of silence before Ricardo replied, his tone unreadable. You did what you had to do. Don't say it like that, Isabel snapped. He's dead because of me. I pushed him to go through with it. I told him I'd only stay if he did. I thought I loved him, but after he died, I didn't want to lose everything. You were there. You understood. Rebecca's hands were trembling, but her face remained expressionless. She listened to her daughter-in-law confess to helping conceal her husband's death as if it were nothing more than a bad decision at a dinner table. The sound of rain outside grew heavier, matching the pounding of her heart. She couldn't look away. Every word was a blade. Every confession peeled another layer off the life she'd thought she'd known. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca sat motionless, staring at the frozen image on the screen. Isabel's face, her expression strangely calm, the flicker of candlelight behind her. It was the kind of silence that didn't just settle in a room. It burrowed inside you, deep and cold. Rebecca slowly closed the laptop and exhaled. She felt no tears, no hysteria. The part of her that could weep had burned out years ago, in the same fire that had supposedly taken Robert's life. What remained was a stillness that terrified even her, the calm before something irreversible. She rose from her chair, her joints stiff, her movements deliberate. On the mantel, a framed photo of her, and Robert smiled back at her. The vineyard in full bloom behind them, his arm around her shoulders, his ring glinting in the sun. She picked it up, studied it for a long moment, then set it face down. Rebecca knew what the law would say, that there wasn't enough to prosecute, that too much time had passed, that Isabel's words would dissolve into speculation. But Rebecca wasn't thinking about courts or justice in the legal sense. What she had now was truth. And truth, she thought, had its own way of punishing people. She turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried in the still air. Tomorrow, she said, this ends. The following Thursday. The vineyard glowed under the soft amber light of dusk. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary and roasted lamb, a familiar comfort that had once filled this home with laughter. Rebecca set the last plate on the table, smoothing the linen napkins with steady hands. Everything was perfect, every detail in place. The doorbell rang right on time. Thomas entered first, carrying a bottle of wine, his arm casually around Isabel's shoulders. We brought one of your favorites, Mom, he said cheerfully. Cabernet from Napa. Rebecca smiled warmly, taking the bottle. How thoughtful. Her voice carried no tremor, no hint of the storm beneath the surface. They sat around the dining table, the candlelight dancing across their faces. Isabel looked radiant, her laughter soft and practiced. To an outsider, the three of them would seem like any other family sharing a quiet meal. But Rebecca could feel the lie in the air, as tangible as the silverware in her hands. She poured the wine slowly, the dark liquid swirling into each glass. To family, she said. To family, they echoed. Dinner began with polite conversation. Thomas talked about the vineyard expansion, about hiring new staff for the tasting room. Isabel chimed in, her tone sweet, measured. But her eyes flickered, cautious, calculating. Rebecca watched her with quiet fascination. Every movement, every smile seemed rehearsed. The kind of performance a guilty person gives when they're waiting for applause that never comes. Halfway through the meal, Rebecca reached for the bottle again. Funny thing, she said lightly, about that old cabin by the lake. I stopped by last week. The knife slipped from Isabel's hand. It hit the plate with a sharp clink. Thomas glanced up, surprised. The old cabin? I thought Dad sold that place ages ago. That's what I thought too, Rebecca said, her eyes never leaving Isabel's face. Turns out it's still standing. Beautiful spot, really. Someone's been taking good care of it. A faint flush crept up Isabel's neck. "Oh, I didn't know," she murmured, reaching for her water glass. Rebecca smiled gently. "Oh, I think you did." The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas, oblivious, tried to fill it. "You know, Dad always loved that lake. He used to say he'd retire there someday." "Yes," Rebecca said softly. "He almost did." Her words hung in the air, delicate but lethal. Isabel froze, her eyes darting toward Rebecca, searching for meaning, for mercy. Rebecca leaned back, her expression serene. "I also found something interesting," she continued. "The cameras I'd set up there months ago. I'd forgotten all about them until recently. So I checked the footage." The room seemed to shrink. Isabel's hand trembled as she set down her glass. Rebecca's tone was calm, almost tender. "You really should have picked a better hiding place for the wine, dear." The label was unmistakable. "Our Vineyards 2014 Reserve. Robert's favorite vintage." Thomas frowned. Confused. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Rebecca smiled at him, her eyes soft with maternal affection. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. Just a memory I finally understood." Then she turned to Isabel, the smile still there, but her gaze sharp as glass. "Some truths," she said quietly, "don't need to be spoken aloud. Once they're seen, they never leave you." Isabel's color drained completely. Her fork clattered against the plate, untouched food growing cold. She couldn't meet Rebecca's eyes. Rebecca stood, gathering the dishes with practiced grace. "More wine?" she asked pleasantly, but Isabel only shook her head, her breath shallow, her hands trembling under the table. Rebecca didn't push further. She didn't need to. The silence did the work for her. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace, not the kind born from forgiveness, but from the quiet certainty that the lies were over. Winter came late that year, slow and hesitant, as if even the seasons didn't want to touch the Thompson vineyard. The vines stood bare beneath the gray sky, their twisted branches gleaming faintly with frost. Life at the estate had grown quieter, emptier, yet somehow Rebecca found comfort in the stillness. 3 months had passed since the dinner. Isabel had left Texas within a week, telling Thomas she needed time to think. 2 weeks later, divorce papers arrived by courier. Rebecca didn't ask what had been said between them, but she suspected Thomas had seen enough truth in his wife's eyes to stop asking questions. The town whispered, as small towns always do. They said Isabel had run off with a man from New Mexico. They said she'd been caught embezzling from the vineyard accounts. They said everything but the truth. Rebecca let them. The truth belonged to her, and it no longer needed witnesses. Most days, she spent her time in the old office, clearing out Robert's papers. Decades of receipts, ledgers, and half-written letters filled the drawers. She sorted them with meticulous care, keeping only the things that mattered, the ones that told her who he had really been. When she was done, she packed the rest into boxes and had them taken to the county archive. Then she turned her attention to the property by the lake. When the realtor asked why she wanted to sell it, she simply said, "It's time." The cabin fetched a good price, enough to repair the vineyard fences, repaint the farmhouse, and replace the kitchen window that always stuck in summer. When the paperwork was finalized, Rebecca drove to the lake one last time. She stood by the water's edge, the reflection of the cabin faint on the rippling surface, and whispered, "Goodbye." Back home, the vineyard began to bloom again, as if the earth itself had decided to move on. It was on one of those quiet evenings in early spring, the sky bruised with twilight, that she found it. A wreath of red roses, fresh and fragrant, resting neatly on her front porch. Her breath caught. Red roses, Robert's favorite flowers. For a long moment, she simply stared. There was no card, no note, no sign of who had left them, only the faint imprint of a shoe in the dust by the step. too large to be Isabel's, too deliberate to be random. Rebecca lifted the wreath carefully, inhaling the familiar scent. It stirred nothing in her but a strange, distant ache. Once, the smell of roses had meant love, anniversaries, long summer nights. Now it meant endings. She brought the wreath inside, set it on the hearth, and knelt to open the iron stove door. The fire inside was small, fading. She fed it a few logs, watched the flames catch, then laid the roses gently into the blaze. The petals curled instantly, their red turning to black, then to ash. The air filled with the faint, bittersweet perfume of burning memories. Rebecca watched without blinking. No tears, no trembling, just silence and the rhythmic crackle of wood. When the last ember dimmed, she closed the stove door and straightened. The house felt lighter somehow, not empty but cleansed. Outside, the wind rose across the vineyard, carrying with it the scent of new blossoms. Rebecca stood by the window for a long time, her reflection framed by the darkening glass. For the first time in years, she felt free, not from Robert, not from betrayal, but from the past itself. Spring had returned to the Texas hill country, gentle and green, washing the vineyard in soft sunlight and the scent of new blossoms. 2 years had passed since the night of the dinner, 2 years of quiet, measured days that slipped into each other like pages of a book finally closing. The Thompson vineyard thrived again, no longer haunted by whispers or shadows. Thomas had remarried a kind, grounded woman named Claire who loved the land as much as he did. They'd moved into a small house near the orchard, close enough for Rebecca to hear her grandson's laughter drift across the fields in the afternoons. Emilio was 6 now, wild and curious, chasing butterflies through the vines, his giggles echoing like wind chimes. It was during his birthday party that the past decided to knock again. The guests gathered under a white canopy in the garden, the tables bright with sunflowers and lemonade pitchers. Rebecca stood near the porch, watching Claire light the candles on the cake, when she heard a familiar voice behind her, soft, melodic, unmistakable. "Rebecca." She turned. Isabel stood a few feet away, wearing a pale blue dress and a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Beside her was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his features so eerily similar to Robert's that for a fleeting second, time folded back on itself. Ricardo Hale. They had aged. Isabel's beauty had hardened at the edges. Ricardo's hair had turned silver at the temples. They looked ordinary now. 2 people who had once burned down an entire world and were now living among its ashes, pretending nothing had happened. "Thomas invited us," Isabel said quickly, sensing the tension. He thought it would be good for Emilio. Rebecca nodded once, her expression calm. "Of course." There was no anger left in her voice, no tremor of old wounds, just a stillness that came from knowing the worst was already behind her. She turned back toward the party, her eyes following her grandson as he blew out the candles, his cheeks flushed with joy. Throughout the afternoon, they exchanged small talk, polite, meaningless words about weather, wine, and business. To everyone else, they looked like family. To Rebecca, they were strangers wearing borrowed faces. When the guests began to leave and twilight settled over the hills, Isabel and Ricardo approached her once more. "It's good to see you doing well," Isabel said softly. "I mean that." Rebecca smiled faintly. "I know you do." They stood there a moment longer, unsure what else to say. Finally, Ricardo nodded respectfully, his gaze unreadable. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Thompson." "I already do," she replied. When their car disappeared down the long dirt road, the vineyard grew silent again, the kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore, only breathes. That night, Rebecca sat by the fire, the last letter from Ricardo resting on her lap. It had arrived months ago, full of apologies and half-truths, explaining nothing that truly mattered. She unfolded it once more. reading the closing line. For what it's worth, I think he did love you in his own way. Rebecca stared at the words for a long while, then fed the letter into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. She didn't watch it burn out of anger. She did it because the past no longer belonged to her. The firelight flickered against her face, soft and golden, and she closed her eyes. Maybe I never truly knew the man I loved, she whispered. But I finally know myself, and that's enough. Outside, the wind rustled through the vineyard, carrying with it the sound of new beginnings, quiet, steady, and utterly free.